The moment my husband leaned back in his chair and smiled at me across the conference table, I knew he thought he had already won. His lawyer had just slid a folder across the polished oak surface. My husband didn't even glance at it. He was too busy watching my face, waiting for the trembling lip, the wet eyes, the quiet collapse he had been predicting for months. Instead, I picked up the folder, opened it, and said, "This looks fine." His smile flickered. Just for a second. Then it came back, wider than before. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except me, was that I had spent the last 4 months making sure this moment would look exactly the way he expected it to. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed CPA with 8 years of experience in forensic accounting, and for 3 of those 8 years, I was married to a man who spent every single day trying to make me feel like I was lucky he chose me. My husband and I met at a conference in Chicago. He ran a mid-sized logistics company that his father had built from nothing and left to him at 32. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming effortlessly, and with the kind of confidence that makes you wonder what they know that you don't. I was there presenting a session on internal audit frameworks. He sat in the front row and asked every question. We dated for 14 months. He proposed on a rooftop in Nashville with a ring his mother had picked out. I said yes, because at that point, I still thought the intensity with which he studied me was love. It wasn't. I understood that slowly. The way you understand a house is sinking, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small things. The way he would correct me in front of his colleagues, lightly, almost playfully, but always in public. The way he would ask for my opinion on business decisions, and then explain at length why my thinking was flawed. The way our joint finances slowly, almost imperceptibly, became his finances with my name attached. He never yelled, he never threatened. He was always so reasonable. That's the part that kept me confused for longer than I want to admit. Cruelty doesn't always come with a raised voice. Sometimes it comes in a calm, measured tone and a patient smile. 13 months into our marriage, he suggested I leave my firm. He framed it as generosity. His company was growing, he said. He needed someone he could trust in the financial oversight role. I had more talent than any outside consultant could bring. Why was I wasting it working for someone else? I could work for us. I hesitated. I told him I had built something at my firm. I had clients who relied on me. I had a professional reputation I had spent years earning. He listened to all of it and then said, quietly, that he understood, but he had hoped I would want to invest in our future the way he did. I gave my notice 3 weeks later. What I told myself at the time was that it made sense. That partnerships require sacrifice. That I could always go back. What I didn't let myself say out loud was that somewhere in the logic of his argument, I had felt a door closing and had chosen not to name it. Working inside his company was not the partnership he had described. I had a title VP of Financial Operations, but my actual authority was narrow and conditional. When I flagged concerns, they were reviewed by his CFO, a man who had been with the company for 12 years and treated my presence as a polite inconvenience. When I made decisions, they were walked back in Monday morning meetings I wasn't invited to. When I asked questions, my husband would say, later, with that patient smile, that I was still learning the culture. After 2 years of that, I stopped asking questions inside the company. I started keeping notes instead. Not because I had a plan, not yet, but because something in the training I had spent a decade building quietly refused to stop functioning. Numbers don't lie. Patterns don't appear by accident. And the patterns I was seeing in the company's financial structure had begun to look less like ordinary business decisions and more like architecture, a very deliberate, very careful architecture designed to concentrate assets in specific entities while everything adjacent slowly hollowed out. I didn't say anything to my husband. I just watched, and I documented, and I waited to understand what I was looking at. The marriage ended technically on a Tuesday in March. He came home and told me, over dinner, he had made himself, which should have been my first warning that something unusual was happening, that he thought we had grown apart. That he cared about me, but had come to realize they weren't compatible at the level a marriage required. He was kind about it, he used all the right words. He said he hoped we could be mature. I asked if there was someone else. He said that wasn't the issue. Which is not the same as no. Within 2 weeks, he had moved into a furnished apartment downtown, and within 3 weeks, his attorney had contacted mine with a proposed settlement. It was generous looking on the surface. He would keep the business assets and the investment accounts associated with the company. I would keep the house, my car, and a lump sum settlement that was, his attorney noted, significantly above what I would likely receive through standard equitable distribution in our state. My attorney called me after reading it and said it was actually a reasonable offer. That I should seriously consider it. I told her I needed a few more weeks. What I had understood by then, after months of quiet documentation, was what the architecture was actually for. The investment accounts he was keeping were largely depleted. The business entities held almost no liquid value. They were structured to carry debt efficiently while accumulating assets in subsidiary names. The lump sum he was offering me was real, but it was a fraction of what the actual picture looked like once you knew where to look. He had been preparing for this longer than he had let on. Possibly, before he even suggested I join the company, the house he was letting me keep had a mortgage he had refinanced 18 months earlier. I had signed the documents without reading them thoroughly, because he had handed them to me after a long workday with a brief explanation, and at that point, I was still in the phase of the marriage where I extended trust because withdrawing it felt like an accusation. The refinancing had restructured the equity in a way that was legal but would significantly complicate any future sale. He had thought of a great many things. The one thing he had not accounted for was that I had spent 18 months working in his company with full access to financial systems, and that I had a background in forensic accounting, and that I had been quietly making copies of things. Not to use as weapons. I want to be clear about that. What I had documented was not all necessarily actionable. Some of it was simply business decisions that looked unflattering in context. But some of it was something else entirely. There was one entity, a holding company registered in Delaware, that appeared in the corporate structure as a passive investment vehicle that I had never been able to get a clear explanation for. The cash flows in and out of that entity over the preceding 26 months didn't correspond to any investment activity I could identify. They did, however, correspond with notable precision to several large personal expenditures that appeared in records I had access to through our joint accounts before he restructured those as well. I hired an outside forensic accountant, a woman named Denise, who had 20 years of experience and the kind of quiet thoroughness that rarely makes headlines but wins cases. I paid her out of a personal savings account I had maintained separately since before the marriage, a habit my mother had instilled in me that I had never thought to mention to my husband because he had never thought to ask. Denise worked for 6 weeks. When she came back to me, she set a report on the table between us and said, "Claire, I want you to know I've seen a lot of creative financial structures in my career, and this one is genuinely impressive." That was not a compliment to him. What she had found, documented, and sourced to verifiable records was that the Delaware entity had been used to receive and redistribute funds that originated in the company's operating accounts my employer for 2 of those years, in a pattern consistent with undisclosed personal compensation structured to avoid the compensation. Marital estate. In plain language, he had been moving money out of their shared financial picture in a way that was deliberately obscured, and had been doing it for at least 2 years before he told me over a home-cooked dinner that they had grown apart. I took Denise's report to my attorney. My attorney read it twice, set it down, and looked at me across her desk for a long moment before saying, "Where did you get this?" I told her I used to be good at my job before someone convinced me I was wasting it working for someone else. She filed a motion to reopen the asset discovery process the following week. That is when my husband's demeanor changed. Not dramatically, he was never dramatic. But I could tell from the way his attorney's communications shifted in tone from smooth and slightly condescending to careful and measured that he understood something had changed. He requested a settlement conference. At the conference, he made a new offer. It was better. Substantially better. He looked at me across the table with an expression I had not seen on his face before, and I realized, after a moment, that it was uncertainty. He did not know exactly what I had. I let the silence sit for a while. My attorney started to speak, and I touched her arm lightly. Then I said, "I don't think we're quite there yet." His attorney asked what I was looking for. I told them I wanted full independent valuation of all entities in the corporate structure going back 3 years. I wanted documentation of the Delaware holding company's transaction history. And I wanted the house refinancing reviewed by a neutral third party. His attorney said that seemed excessive given the offer on the table. My attorney opened a folder and slid 3 pages across. She had highlighted the relevant sections. Nobody said anything for close to 30 seconds. Then my husband's attorney asked for a brief recess. They were in the hallway for 11 minutes. When they came back, his attorney sat down and said they were prepared to discuss a revised framework. The final settlement took another 6 weeks to negotiate. I'm not going to detail every piece of it, partly for legal reasons and partly because the specific numbers are not the point. What I will say is that it was meaningfully different from the original offer. The house was restructured so that the equity issue was resolved. The lump sum was revised. Certain assets that had been characterized as business property were reclassified. A separate agreement addressed the Delaware entity in terms that my attorney described as the cleanest resolution she had seen in a complex asset case in several years. When I signed the final documents, my husband was not in the room, his attorney was there. She was professional and efficient, and just as she was gathering her copies to leave, she paused and said, almost to herself, that her client had underestimated me. I told her that happened a lot. I want to tell you about the part that came after, because I think it's the part people don't talk about enough. Winning, if that's even the right word for what a divorce settlement is, does not feel the way you expect it to. There was no moment of triumph, there was no rush of satisfaction. What there was, on the evening after I signed those final documents, was a very quiet apartment, a glass of wine I barely touched, and something that felt less like relief and more like the absence of a weight I had carried so long I had stopped noticing it was there. I called my mother. She asked how I was doing, and I said I thought I was okay, and I meant it in a way I hadn't been able to mean it for several years. I called Denise, my forensic accountant, and thanked her. She said it had been genuinely interesting work and asked if I had considered going back to practice. I told her I had been thinking about it. That call lasted 45 minutes. By the end of it, Denise and I had the outline of a conversation about a consulting partnership that I will not call a plan yet because it is still early, but which I think about most mornings with something that might be cautious excitement. I went back to my professional license review course the following month. I had let some continuing education requirements lapse during the years I worked inside my husband's company, and catching up meant several months of coursework I was fitting around everything else. It was, unexpectedly, one of the best things I did for myself in the aftermath of all of this. There's something stabilizing about returning to a body of knowledge that doesn't shift depending on who's in the room. I also started telling people what had happened. Not in a public way, not with any kind of performance of grievance, but when friends asked how I was doing, I told them the real version instead of the curated one. Several of them told me they had sensed something was wrong for years and hadn't known how to ask. One of them told me about something similar that had happened to her sister, and we ended up in a 3-hour conversation that I think helped both of us more than either of us expected. I don't know exactly what my husband told people about how the settlement went. I heard secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance, that he described it as amicable. I found that word quietly funny. I don't have any particular desire to correct the record. What I know is this: I spent 3 years inside a situation that was designed, with considerable sophistication, to reduce my options without my realizing it was happening. The job that became his company. The finances that became his architecture. The documents I signed too quickly. Each one of these things was small and reasonable, seeming on its own. Together they were something else. But here is what I also know. The same training that was supposed to make me useful to him was the thing he couldn't architect away. He could restructure accounts and reclassify assets and build entities in Delaware, but he could not make me stop understanding what I was looking at. He just assumed I would stop looking. That assumption was the only mistake he made that actually cost him. I think about that sometimes when I'm working through something complicated, a set of numbers that doesn't add up, A structure that looks clean until you find the thread that unravels it. I think about the difference between confidence and comprehension. He had enormous confidence. He was also, it turned out, not nearly as comprehensive as he believed. I am 31 years old. I have a forensic accounting background, a settlement that reflects what I was actually owed, and a consulting conversation with a colleague who respects the work. I have a house with clean equity and a savings account that has been mine alone since before any of this started. I have also, for the first time in several years, the sustained experience of making a decision and having it simply be my decision, with no quiet revision in a Monday morning meeting I wasn't invited to. That last part is not nothing. In fact, most mornings, it feels like the most important part of all. If you're watching this and something in it sounds familiar, not the details, but the feeling, that slow accumulation of small, reasonable things that together don't add up, I want you to know that you are probably not imagining it. Confusion that persists is usually telling you something. The thing it's telling you is worth listening to. And if you happen to have a skill set you've been convinced you're not supposed to use anymore, it might be worth asking yourself who benefits most from you believing that.